Ladies and gentlemen, it really is a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Samantha Brennan. Samantha hails from the Maritimes and has lived in all of Newfoundland and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, studied at Dalhousie and then did her doctorate at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She then came to join the department here and has been a very distinguished colleague. She has served as chair of the department for 8 years, which is, I can tell you, a really punishing assignment. Having done it myself too. She's also, in addition to a member of the philosophy department, a member of the Rotman Institute for Philosophy of Science, and also part of the graduate faculty in political science and in feminist studies and research. Her chief philosophical interest has been in politics and ethics, and much of it has borne upon children. We don't often think about ethical questions raised by children and family. And so I'm just delighted that her talk this evening is going to be a presentation of some of those interests. Samantha.
So tonight we're going to be thinking philosophically about the family. My plan is to talk in general a little bit about philosophy and the family, and then after having sort of introduced the general area, talk about 3 different projects or questions that I'm interested in that have to do with ethical questions, primarily about family, parents, children, about how work is divided in the home, and what the family looks like. So what I'm really interested in the big picture, is what makes a group of people a family, as opposed to just some people who live together. Families don't even have to live together. The role that families play in our society, what the future of the family looks like, and how do we think about justice and the family. So over the past 10 years, that's what I've been working on. My main work is as a theorist of rights. And then what I've been interested in is thinking about how we can apply rights to thinking about the family and thinking about justice in the family. So here are some of the questions that philosophers are concerned about. Is this working? There we go. So what makes a group of people a family? What do we owe our children? How should we think about family obligations beyond the parent? The parent-child relationship is the one we always focus on, but I actually think there's interesting questions to be asked too about what we owe our siblings, what grandparents owe children, the family relationships beyond the immediate ones. And then, is the family a just institution? What do we want to say about the family as an institution? Now, many of you probably know that we've just had new census data just came out about the family. So what's interesting about this, says the CBC, the nuclear family is no longer the norm in Canada. It hasn't been the norm for a very long while in the sense of the usual family. So according to the CBC, the mom, pop, and 3 kids under one roof, the typified Canadian households, has morphed into a complex and diverse web of family ties, including living alone, remarried, stepchildren, blah, 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 empty nesters. It's always been that way. It's not as if we had a heyday of the nuclear family and now it's changing. Things are changing more now, but it's always been more complicated than the nuclear family. So now they say, well, less than a quarter of our families, now a quarter of households that they count as families, are the mom, dad, kids, and dog at home. And lots of people still think that's what the family looks like, but yeah, less than 1/4 of families look like that. So there's the Leave It to Beaver family. That's actually predates me. I don't think I've ever actually watched Leave It to Beaver, but there's the Leave It to Beaver family that everyone thinks of from the 1950s. And the one question to ask really is if the family ever was that way. Certainly the family was often, larger than the 2 parents and children plus dog. I mean, that's more than some of the families we're talking about, but a lot less than the family arrangements lots of people have. So in my own family, I live with my parents and my partner and our children, and we're a family. And it would be hard-pressed to say who counts and who doesn't count. My parents are part of my family. So one question asked is whether that family ever existed. If you want to read a really fun book about whether or not that family ever existed, certainly in its idealized version, the values that we associated with that family weren't actually there. So the 1950s, higher teen pregnancy rates than now, domestic abuse, conflict, repression, anxiety, frequently poor and much less idyllic. So the 1950s is this idea of the golden age of the nuclear family. It wasn't that golden for the people who lived there. So that's a bit of kind of where we are right now with the family and a little bit of history. And now I want to talk about why political philosophers ought to be concerned with the family. So the division of labor between what political philosophers are really interested in is this question of the relationship we have with the state. And often the picture we draw is of lots of individuals, and then we have the state, and we imagine arrows going up to the state. But that's not really the way it looks like. The work is distributed. And often the way the work is distributed is through families. Often it's a relationship between households and the state, not individuals in the state. That varies from place to place. Some countries that we think of as being kind of to the left of Canada, in fact, have a more individualistic relationship. So Sweden, for example, in terms of children's rights, has a more mapping one-to-one. There's a direct relationship between the state and the child. In Canada, we are more likely to think of it as a relationship between families and the state. So our model leaves a lot to families. A lot of the distribution of goods we rely on to come through the family. And once we have that model, then it looks like the family matters. We give parents a lot of discretion when it comes to raising their children, and most of us think that's a very good thing. It's what makes, many people think what makes a family is the discretion parents have to raise their children. But that raises, again, these questions about justice. Here's two of them. One has to do with what goes on inside the family and whether or not the actions that go on inside the family are themselves just. And the other question is justice between families. So is what's going on just for the family members? And then if we leave family members alone to raise their children and have a family, then we have to ask questions about equality between different families and how to handle those things. So one family might devote a lot of resources to their children, another might not, and that might put those children at different starting points. And so we have questions of equality between families that matter. So feminists have been quick to say that political philosophy, the history of political philosophy, has had little to say about the family. That's probably not quite right. Plato had things to say about the family. John Stuart Mill had things to say about the family. But it is true that an awful lot of political philosophy has nothing to say about the family. If you're thinking about Hobbes is my favorite. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes has got a great example of thinking about political philosophy without families because he thinks about political philosophy without children. He says, imagine men sprung out of the earth as if like mushrooms. What? Mushrooms? No, people aren't mushrooms. We don't imagine them in their fully formed version. They don't, babies aren't mushrooms. But for Hobbes, they were. So Oken says that philosophers have had little to say about the family. That's, I think, mostly right. Here's why that's so. There's been two roles the family has played in political philosophy that have not been very helpful. And the first is as a space, this kind of precious space beyond justice. The idea that there's a haven in which the rules do not apply. It's the picture is as if justice has all these demands on us, is asking us all these things of us, all these requirements about what we have to do. But in the family, we get a break. It's this special place. You can see why that's going to be not a very helpful picture of the role family plays. The other, also not helpful, we came across this actually in my graduate seminar today talking about political philosophy and egalitarianism. And even today, philosophers writing as if we could just ask, what would a parent do to get a question of what the just state ought to do? So the philosopher Ronald Dworkin is asking about egalitarianism and says, suppose you have 2 children and you have to divide some good between these children. How would you divide it? Like, really? You're going to ask parents? Like, do parents have a theory about how they ought to divide it? It's not clear to me that parents are automatically egalitarians, that parents are automatically just, and that we can just figure out the way the family works and then apply that to the rest of our political realm. That's not going to be very helpful either, given that we don't have a theory about what justice in the family consists in. So there's been this return recently of philosophers thinking about the family. I want to give you a little bit of the flavor of some of the things people are working on, and then talk about some of the projects that interest me. These are just kind of reading recommendations. So here's why it's not so helpful first. So lots of injustice goes on in the home. Most of us know this. When we talk about, most of us who are parents are scared of stranger abduction. Stranger abduction is the one thing that everybody worries about. So all of the alerts on Facebook that go off are all about stranger abduction. But most abduction of children and most harm done to children is done by people they know. It occurs in families, not outside families. So again, the family isn't this haven. Rather, the family is the place where a lot of problems occur. It's not a refuge from injustice. It may be the place that injustice happens the most when it comes to children. Likewise, domestic violence. And this idea that the family exists pre-politically, that we can do political philosophy after we have families because they're natural, isn't quite right either, because families are constructed by the law. We have rules about who can and can't be a family, who can and can't adopt children. All of those are legal matters, and so we don't have a family outside the law, kind of separate from it. And justice within the family matters. Here's 2 ways it matters. It matters intrinsically, that is, it matters for the sake of what happens in the family. And it also matters because it has effects that go on outside the family. So Susan Muller-Okin says it's really hard to raise democratic citizens in authoritarian households. I mean, the family is the education, the political education of the child, and children watch how decisions are made in their home. And if you're trying to raise democratic citizens, having an authoritarian household and then having a little bit of add-on democratic education, and what do you have now? Sort of grade 10 civics. Grade 10 civics is not going to make up for a lifetime of living in an authoritarian household. That's where people learn to be just. The other spillover effect we'll talk about a bit more later, but it's if we're egalitarians and want women to participate in politics, there is a spillover effect of having unjust division of labor in the home. You might think, again, the family is separate, but the family is not it's not a hermetic bubble. It's not sealed. Things that happen in the family affect what happens outside the family. And if women are tied up inside the family raising children, they're not likely to be members of parliament. They're not likely to be politically engaged citizens. Okay, so now what I thought we had before, which are examples of other things philosophers are interested in and recommendations. Here's some examples of really good recent work in this area. Elizabeth Brake's new book, Minimizing Marriage, a terrific new book for thinking about how we might rethink marriage and sort of attach less significance to it. Sort of marriage that's worth having and sharing. There we go. Procreation and parenthood, lots of literature here. Interestingly, a lot of it by men. That's kind of a fascinating, I never know whether I think this is a good or a bad thing. Philosophy has an awful lot of work done by men, and ethics, which is my area, is one of the few areas that's about equal, except some of this literature on procreative ethics, which has a lot of men, a lot of guys write, including these 2, David Archer and David Benatar. Terrific book, though, Procreation and Parenthood. Sally Hassinger and Charlotte Witt on adoption. Again, lots of good essays on adoption and adoptive families, kind of breaking down the necessity of a biological tie for a family. And here's my book with an explanation with, never, ever, ever say I don't care about covers. I hate that cover. And it actually has a little teddy bear for each chapter. I thought, oh no. Anyway, a book I co-edited with Robert Noggle on how it is that we might take responsibility for children, the various models we have for caring for children. My contribution to that is actually a co-authored paper with Angela White on the obligation we have not to smoke in the home, which I think we have an obligation not to smoke in the home. I certainly had an obligation as a foster parent not to smoke in the home, and I was shocked that I couldn't do it because I was a foster parent, but I could have. With children they were biologically mine. I could smoke as much as I wanted. I don't smoke, but it was an odd question. Actually, there's a long list of things I couldn't do to children in foster care that I could do to my own. That I thought, wow, this is a great list of rules. But wait, they don't apply the minute I adopted them, they would no longer apply? That seems kind of odd. Anyway, so here are the 3 questions I'm interested in that we're going to talk about a little bit each. What do we owe our children? How to divide work in the home, and how many parents can a child have? So I'm going to give kind of roughly 10 minutes to each question, and then we'll have time for a discussion. So this is the whirlwind view of these questions. So the first question is, what do we owe our children? And by we here, I mean parents. I'm really interested in parents and the obligations parents have to children. And what I'm interested in is, what is it that we have to do, morally speaking, if we're going to be good parents? Now, part of this will depend on how we think about children. There's some suggestions here. Property, that's a very old suggestion. I suggest we reject it and move on. Children aren't our belongings. Projects, I think more likely, I think lots of contemporary parents think about children as projects. They're kind of like a hobby. They're kind of something you do. I'm not saying this is the way we ought to, but I'm saying often it's the way we think about children. The economist Nancy Fulbert thinks we often think of them as pets. Why pets? Because they're expensive hobbies. And they're individually the responsibility of the person who takes them on. So if I choose to have a child, that's like choosing to have a Labradoodle. And so I'm responsible for the vet bills, and if anything happens, it's all mine. This is just my thing that I do. Could be a Labradoodle owner. So she thinks being a parent is kind of like being a Labradoodle owner. It's an expensive hobby. Again, she's not saying we ought to think about children that way, but rather that we do. So I've argued instead that we should think about children as having rights. But when children are little, there are going to be rights that protect their interests rather than rights that protect their choices. For adults, I think rights protect our choices, but clearly, babies don't do much choosing, and younger children are probably pretty lousy choosers. So I think when children, their rights develop from protecting interests to protecting choices, and what we have to ask when we're asking what we owe children is, what interests do children have? That's because lots of the literature on children's rights, I think, gets it wrong because it's future-directed. So lots of people worry about children by worrying about how they turn out. It's the end product that matters. It's as if our obligations as parents, I'm a parent of teenagers, so sometimes I think this is right, that our obligation is just to get them to the threshold of adulthood and then we're done. I'm clear, I've succeeded. And some people write this way. I worry that some of the literature on children's rights is about this. So Joel Feinberg, a famous paper, talks about the right to an open future. But notice that's an entirely future-directed kind of right. We are interested in raising somebody with the most options possible. And I think this is because we subscribe to a view that's the negative conception of childhood. That is, childhood is entirely forward-looking, where children are just, it's a period of deficits, and what they're doing is they're just developing. And what happens in adult life counts, but what happens in childhood doesn't. So in the negative conception, we have children as smaller, weaker, less rational, less autonomous. They're just like us, but worse, smaller and worse. They have everything we have, but they're not quite developed yet. They're kind of underdone. And we have to protect them to get them to adulthood when things matter, but nothing they do now really counts. And again, I think that's probably wrong. Contemporary neuroscience certainly thinks it wrong. I love this book, The Philosophical Baby. Alison Gopnik talks about being a baby, being a learning baby, is like being in love in Paris for the first time after you've had 3 double espressos. That's what she thinks being a baby would be like. So not dull and sleepy, but wow, kind of amazing. And what happens as we develop is not turning from a blank slate into something with some content, but rather the narrowing of connections and possibilities. Which conception of childhood do we have? One way to test your intuitions is to see whether or not you drug your child out of childhood for their own sake, or whether or not to achieve what it is you want to achieve. If you could just have them go away, if you could just give your child a pill that would make them the best 18-year-old they could be with none of the intervening years, would you do it? And I think most of us who are parents wouldn't. I mean, there's some years you might not want. Again, I'm thinking that, the odd 6 months here or there, you think, we could just skip over that bit. But the idea is that I think there's things of value in childhood, not just the end product. We went the wrong way. There we go. Again, I think lots of people think, around the university these days, I think lots of people think that parents are thinking of children's projects, again, with the end result. And we have the phenomenon of the helicopter parents hovering around campus, seeing how their product is doing, because they want to make sure that things are going well at university. The average time, I think they visit campus now, we had a statistic that they visit campus now, a parent will visit the university on average 6 times. 6 times? I don't think my parents visited once. Off I went. And I came home. They didn't visit me. And often they want to stay in the dorms and hang out with the students. It's a different world. So if we have a positive conception of childhood, where there are things in childhood that matter, then I think we have a different picture of parenthood. Yes, we have the obligation to bring children successfully to the end of their period of childhood and bring them to the threshold of being an adult. But we also have responsibilities for our children to have good childhoods, to have the things that are good for them as children. The idea here is there are things that are good in childhood for children besides the developmental goods and landing on the door safely of the adult years. And if that's right, then I think parenting is more demanding, but also an awful lot more interesting. Okay. Second problem. How ought we to divide work in the home? This is kind of a standard problem for those of us interested in feminism and political philosophy. And it's primarily concerned about people in opposite sex relationships. And it's traditionally, the problem goes about the division of work between men and women in opposite sex relationships. And the question is the one we raised earlier about whether or not this hampers women's political participation. If it's bad in other ways, too. Here's a bit why it matters. It matters even before one enters this kind of relationship because the expectations shape the kind of career you choose. I did a career day for Girl Guides, and I was shocked at the number of questions I got from girls who I thought were too young to worry about such things, about juggling, and time for my job and time for my family. And if all the Girl Guides are worried about juggling, and it's not occurring to the Boy Scouts to worry about juggling, they're not asking about juggling. So you've got all these people who are planning their careers expecting they'll juggle, and people who are planning their careers expecting they won't. You can imagine what happens when they get together. Likewise, it matters during marriage. Again, opposite sex relationships, the greater domestic responsibilities, constrain women's career options, reduce exit options, less time for leisure, and make women more vulnerable. One of the striking facts about the economics of opposite sex marriages concerns the risk of abuse and income, particularly the income differential between men and women. The greater that gap the more likely you are to be abused if you're a woman in an opposite-sex relationship. So again, the staying at home matters, and the adding children to the mix matters. Economists who love to measure such gloomy things can tell you about the increase in risk for each child you have. Why? Well, it reduces your exit options, makes the threat of leaving less plausible. And likewise, after marriage and divorce. We all know those. So here's two approaches to the problem that philosophers, political philosophers have offered. Justice and efficiency. I'll talk a little bit about both approaches. So the justice approach asks, as does the philosopher John Rawls, how would we structure our society if we had to agree to the rules, not knowing who we would be? So not knowing if we were male or female, not knowing if we'd end up in an opposite-sex relationship, what rules would we choose? And the recommendations that Okun recommends are quite striking. Shared parental responsibility for childcare, equal parental leave policies, high-quality daycare, good education, flexible work hours. This is really interesting. She recommends in families that choose the traditional division of labor, an income split paycheck, and that be enforced by the state. We protect the vulnerable by dividing the paycheck at the source and essentially sending two checks home, one for the female partner and one for the male. She thinks we ought to make that lifestyle available to those who choose it, but recognize that it's risky. Okay. It's kind of a striking suggestion. It sort of hits you in the face with, wow, it's an idea. The other approach thinks more strategic. The first approach is justice. This approach is more efficiency. It looks more at individual choices. And also quite striking, analyzes the problem in terms of rational choice and looks at how the gender division of work in the home is actually the result of a bunch of different choices that we've made all along the way. Rona Mahoney's not interested in why traditional couples have a traditional division of labor. That's what they want. What she's interested in are why people who say they have egalitarian commitments end up with a traditional division of work. How come they get it wrong? They both want the same thing. They both want an egalitarian relationship. Rona Mahoney says, well, how come they haven't got one? Here's some of the relevant factors. These always depress me, so I'll just get gloomy for this bit. In terms of income, women marry up, men marry down in terms of education. What that means, she looked at the Stanford MBA graduating class. Women who make $175,000 a year on average for their first job. They marry men who make more. Why? They don't need to. They could have married some handsome, attractive guitar player, a philosopher. You know, there's lots of good choices out there of them making less money but interesting. But they don't. Our past choices make an uneven division of labor rational now. Once we've set ourselves on that track, then it's hard to get off it. It's hard to and housework doesn't divide 50-50. It's work to divide things 50-50. Usually it's easier for the person who plans the meals to do the cooking, to do the grocery shopping. Those tasks tend to lump together. If you're home with children, it's easier for you to do a lot of the things since you're already at home. There's a tipping point at which things just collapse into being mostly one person's job. Again, it's not the most efficient. You notice in the grocery store, the only couples you see together in the grocery store, really young people and really old people. They're the only people with time for two people to grocery shop. In regular families, two people don't grocery shop. One person grocery shops because the other person is home with the kids or doing something else. So she's really interested in this, in how it is we end up in egalitarian relationships. She also talks about women typically marrying men, women who marry men typically marrying men who are, so they're already bigger to start with, they just come that way. But then we marry them 2 years older, and they make more money, and they have more education, and then we set out to negotiate and say, how come we haven't got an equal relationship? How come this isn't a relationship that I can negotiate what I want? Well, maybe if I'd started with someone I would have an easier time negotiating with, I would have done better. So Rona Mahoney thinks her advice, of course, if you intend on marrying someone of the opposite sex and you're not there yet, educate up, marry down. That's her biggest piece of advice. When it comes to housework, we all know this one, avoid gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is where you say, I set the standards and you don't do a good enough job. If you're the person who says you don't do a good enough job, you're going to be doing that job for the rest of your life. Give up, choose, compromise on standards. So lower your standards. And she thinks, starting from day one, don't be the more competent parent. Leave your partner alone with the children from the early days. So we have two sets of advice, a justice approach and efficiency approach. People sometimes engaged in this literature think they're at odds with one another. I don't think they are. Rona Mahoney doesn't think Oken's approach will do it entirely. That might be right. We can imagine this both as individual strategic advice. At the same time, we want the state to change the rewards. Both seem plausible to me. So the final one I want to talk about is the how many parents a child can have. And this is a paper that I've been working on with one of our graduate students, Bill Cameron. And it's really an interesting question because it's in light of the creation of alternative models of the family. So we've got, as you saw from that statistics, we've got a lot of changes going on in the family. But what we don't have in some areas is a change in the law. So the law says you can have 0 parents, you can have 1 parent, or you can have 2, and we stop there. That's it. Those are your choices. So 2, you can have at most 2 parents. And you can see where the at most 2 parents comes from, but it's not a very helpful answer today. And in fact, even today, now we have, thanks to recent efforts in reproductive technology, we now have 3 biological parent families. But I'm more interested in the not 3 non-biological parents or multiple non-biological parents. So what we're interested in is changes in family structure. Open adoption is a nice one, where we have multiple people who are in a parent-like relationship with a child. And we want to ask who the parents are. The worry is here, both that if we cut off people who are, in some sense, parents from legal parenthood, that we both hurt the child and the best interest of the child and the kind of life the child could lead, and that we hurt the parents in terms of their rights. Here's another way to think about this. I think we ought to worry a lot more about children who don't have enough parents and worry less about children who have too many. And the too many parents seems like a non-problem, mostly, to me. It's a problem we've made, not a problem that actually need exist. Some of you know the case that I'm talking about, that the most recent case is in 2007. It's a London, Ontario case, called in the literature the 3-parent case, and it was the Ontario Court of Appeal. The only legal 3-parent family in Canada lives in London, Ontario. They're it. And this was a case of a lesbian couple who, when the biological mother gave birth to the child, the space on the birth certificate would read mother and father. The idea would be biological mother and biological father. And so they filled it out with the biological mother and biological father because they intended to involve the father in the child's life. But then they realized that what would happen is that the other mother would have no status. So when the biological mother was traveling, the other mother had no parental rights. So they went in and tried to have what was the second parent adoption. They said, you're not the second parent, you're the third parent. We got to get rid of this guy. And they said, we're not getting rid of this guy. This guy is my child's father. And we want him to have parental rights too. And it took a few rounds of the Ontario court before the judge ruled that when we drafted the laws about numbers of parents, we hadn't thought about this sort of case. And he thought there was no reason not to include 3 parents. It's still the case that anybody else who wants to have a 3rd parent added would have to go through the same procedure. It's not automatic, but maybe that's not a bad thing either. So in the US, the courts have, again, they also have a 2-parent rule, and they have these 4 different categories that they thought will ground claims of parenthood: genetics, intent, marriage, and acting like a parent, parental conduct. And you can see how on a certain model, that would usually be 2, okay? But now you can see how those same criteria, once we apply them, could give us more than 2. So Rebecca Wald, a legal scholar, writes, when we look to intent and conduct instead of only biology and marriage, it quickly becomes clear there may be more than 2 people who are candidates for the legal title parent. So what we're interested in here are a kind of range of relationships from same-sex couples to open adoption to step-parent families. The case history is just, there are some fascinating cases. Wald goes through a number of them that are really interesting. A couple, the wife has an affair, becomes pregnant, and involves the other couple in the raising of the child. So the child is actually jointly raised by the 2 couples, and in fact has 4 people actively involved in parenting the child. So she gives birth to the child, names both biological dad and husband, and then the person who ends up being the stay-at-home parent is the wife of the man with whom she had the affair, and they become 2 families raising this child. Again, 4 parents. And it seems to me, in this case, again, like the 3-parent case, where all the parents are on board and everybody agrees. It's not like they're arguing. They're only arguing with the state. They're not arguing with one another. They all think that all 4 of them are parents. It seems to me the problem, again, shouldn't be with families that have too many parents. We ought to think again about families that have too few. I think much harder to be a single parent than to be one of 4. And by the way, for thinking of decision-making, of course, 3 does better than 2. Right? 2, you just get a stalemate every time you're trying to make a decision. So here's, this is a great book. The book is called And Baby Makes More, and it's about intentional parenthood and about, this is a very large, sprawling family of choice. And again, the idea here is that from the very beginning, a community was involved in this decision to have children. You could just have a 2-parent family, but in this case, they chose not to, and they have a multi-parent family raising the child. When I started thinking about this, there was a movie I watched that reminded me of some of these issues, and it's about a boy. And I love this. 2 people isn't enough. You need backup. If there are only 2 people and someone drops off an edge, then you're on your own. 2 isn't a large enough number. You need 3 at least. That's the child thinking about how many parents he might need. He's worried about what's going to happen to them, and so he's got his idea of the ideal number. And then I want to raise a more radical suggestion that I'm working on for a paper for a conference next month that says, look, maybe we should just do away with romantic love as the foundation of the family. Why do we think that, if we think children need stability, why do we think the family based on romantic love is the ideal way to start? That's a pretty fragile bond. Why don't we form families around the care of children rather than around romantic love? But that's a more radical suggestion, and one that I'm going to take up later, and we'll see how that goes. And I'll come talk to you about that maybe next year. So here, in the meantime, is where to find me. Let's see. So there's some of the places to find me, or at home with my family. And thanks very much.